I am delighted to be here representing one half of the editorial panel of the book, which has been wonderfully displayed on my left, the Routledge Handbook of Law and the COVID-19 Pandemic, along with my wonderful colleague and nevertheless friend, Alice Donald. Just to give you an idea of what we're going to do this evening, I'm going to give the very few words, and then I'm going to pass it over to Professor Laurent Pech, who is the head of the law school at Middlesex University. I have no doubt in his few words that are going to be 4 minutes or less, he is going to congratulate himself for hiring both myself and Alice. So I thought that I would cut him off because I know he is a very deeply modest man and would not possibly be congratulating himself for doing that. So I'm going to do it for him. Congratulations, Laurent. We're then going to pass over to the wonderful Adam Wagner, who I'm going to introduce separately because I'll have far warmer, nicer, and less sarcastic words for him. And then we are going to round off the evening with my, again, dear, wonderful friend, collaborator, and colleague, Alice, who's going to talk a little bit more about the book. And I promise she's not going to pitch it to you, although we do have a discount code. So with that, I leave it over to Laurent. 3 minutes or less.
Thank you, dear colleague, and nonetheless friend. I mean, you stole quite a few of my lines, so now I don't know what else to say. I was going to mention that it has been a pleasure working with you and Alice over so many years. Before COVID, actually, we were already working on the rule of law backsliding issues. And I have to say, in those days, I thought it could not get worse in terms of the topics we were researching, because essentially we were working on the dismantlement of checks and balances, resulting, for instance, in one EU member state ceasing to be a democracy in 2019. And we were essentially getting a bit depressed regarding the state of the democracy and rule of law in the EU. And then COVID arrived. And then I realized, yes, things can get worse, and with a direct link to our research. I have to say, I had to admire Joelle's stamina, because essentially when COVID emerged, and then we quickly saw the link with our own research agenda, personally, I decided that was too much for me. I could not cope with the depressing aspects relating to COVID, because we knew that it was going to reinforce essentially this dismantlement in checks and balances in the name of essentially dealing with regulating the disease. And it did get worse. And it's actually quite amazing what you have put together in terms of this excellent collection of essays, which was preceded by something also kind of quite extraordinary. I have to say, I was a bit skeptical you could actually pull it off, but you did, not once, but actually several times. Joelle put together, for those of you who don't know, an extraordinary collection of blog posts published by the Verfassung blog. I think you included at some point up to 60 to 80 countries, more even. And then it was kind of a running joke. I say, well, next time I hope you're going to get closer to the number of countries belonging to the UN. So we didn't quite get yet there, but the book is just magnificent. So congratulations again. And just to conclude, I just wanted all of you to know that I knew Joelle and Alice before they became famous. And I do hope that they will not stop being friends after that, especially after selling many copies of this excellent book, which I recommend strongly and highly to all of you. So thank you. I don't know if I have exceeded my 4 minutes. And I also wanted to say hello to Adam. I've never met Adam, but he's also very famous on Twitter, and it's really a shame. So we have to do another book lunch so that I can shake his hand in person. So Adam, it's a pleasure meeting you, and thank you for doing this, and welcome to this event on behalf of the Bigham Center and the School of Law at Middlesex University, London. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm glad he wasn't more complimentary, as you should never compliment a ginger. We turn the same color as our hair. But no, it is my delight and honor now to welcome Adam to speak with us. It does look like we planned this, as he's unable to join us this evening due to COVID-19. But I do introduce Adam as a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers. He specializes in public law and human rights. He is the leading specialist on COVID-19 and the law here in the UK. And he's actually done an extraordinary public service for everyone in the United Kingdom, in that not only is he probably the only person who actually understands all of the regulations that came down on us, but also he committed to communicating as accessibly and easily and openly as possible law that was often very complex, if not contradictory. But more than that, and especially in the times that we are now living in, holding executive power, holding government to account. And it's for that reason that I'm delighted that he's here to join us this evening to talk about COVID-19 and the law. And my last point is to pitch his own book, which is coming out in October of this year, Emergency State. Check it out. And with that, I warmly welcome Adam to the screen.
Thanks very much, everybody. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Muted for now.
Yeah. Muted. I'm not muted.
I think we can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Oh, thanks, everybody. I was so looking forward to this event because of the, I don't know, countless lectures and interviews and everything else that I've done during this pandemic on this topic. I think I've done one in person, and I was so looking forward to coming and meeting real people and being here and having a drink and chatting. And then both of my children came down with COVID in the last 24 hours, and I thought it was probably best for everybody that I don't come and infect you, because that would be a bit of irony. But we are where we are, and I think it's a useful reminder. Although we didn't really need to have this reminder. But it's a useful reminder that of the phrase that we sometimes hear, that we may be done with COVID, but COVID isn't done with us. And I think that's there's a variation of that phrase, which I've also heard, which is we may be done with history, but history isn't done with us. And another variation of that phrase is those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And when I was reading this book, which I really love, I'm so happy you've come together to write it, and Alice and Joelle have succeeded in what's obviously been a superhuman effort to bring together such excellent expertise and work. But when I was reading it, and I was thinking about what I'd say, I thought it does such a good job at looking at the present across the world and here in the UK, that I wanted instead to look a bit at the past, and use some of the research that I've been doing for my own book, which, as you've heard, is coming out on the 13th of October, called Emergency State, where I try and look at the how this all happened and what happened to the state while it did happen, using the UK as an example. But I think that it applies equally in lots of places, as some of the essays in the book that we're discussing today, that we're launching today, demonstrate. But one question which has fascinated me during the whole pandemic is where our lockdown came from. And on the 23rd of March of 2020, it was almost as if it came out of thin air. The Prime Minister sort of stood up and decreed, from this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction: you must stay at home. And the speed of it was at the time extraordinary. We'd gone from looking at these really unimaginable conditions in Wuhan in China, to thinking that, well, that's not going to happen anywhere else, or at least not in the democratic world. And then all of a sudden it was happening in Italy, it was happening in France, it was happening in Spain. And in the UK, the government had gone almost overnight from what appeared to be a moderate and almost sort of lackadaisical approach to restrictions to a full lockdown. And it was so lackadaisical that by the time the Prime Minister stood up on the 23rd of March, it took another 3 days to actually produce the law which would enforce the lockdown. That's how I talk about this quite a bit in the book, and I'm not going to talk about it today, but it's evidence of how this wasn't planned at all. It was a complete about turn that was unexpected, even from the government perspective. But I want to look at today in the next 20 minutes or so where that 2020 lockdown came from. And it didn't arrive out of the sky in 2020. It had its own history, both as a concept, the idea of lockdowns, and also as in terms of the legal power in the UK to enforce it. Both bits of history are really interesting. And first of all, I'm going to talk about the history of lockdowns and legal powers to enforce them. In fact, the Wuhan lockdown in February 2020 was almost without precedent. It seemed unprecedented, and it basically was. As far as I've been able to find, the first proper national lockdown in the modern age, by which I mean stay-at-home orders applying to everyone except essential workers, was only about 10 years before in Mexico in 2009 during the swine flu outbreak. And there was a lockdown imposed on 111 million people after 99 confirmed cases of swine flu and 8 deaths. Just to think about that. And the president at the time, Felipe Calderon, said there's no safer place than your own home to avoid being infected with the flu virus. That was in 2009. But I've not been able to find any examples of national 24-hour stay-at-home orders before 2009. But, and this is a big but, it has been recognised for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that people gathering together causes certain diseases to spread, meaning that public authorities have often used guidance and sometimes laws backed up by physical force to prevent people mixing and the disease spreading. And although national lockdowns may be new, certain kinds of emergency responses and laws that have been used to contain viruses and pandemics have evolved similar features for centuries. So, for example, going back to the ancient world, plagues were well known, as anybody who knows their ancient history will know. Just to take an example, the Justinian plague of 541 AD was thought to have caused up to 5,000 deaths per day, prompted something called a justitium, which was an ancient Roman emergency law, which allowed a dictator to be appointed in any sort of national emergency. And of course, in the end, it was a dictator that was appointed that killed off the Republic because of Julius Caesar. But going forward about a millennium or so, the word quarantine has its origins in the Black Death, bubonic plague pandemic of the late 1300s, which caused as many as 200 million deaths, way more than COVID has so far. I think we're at about 15 million for COVID. And the idea of quarantine, which we will understand, is to separate and restrict the movement of people after they've been exposed with a contagious disease, as opposed to isolation, which is doing the same for people who have been confirmed to have the disease. And the first known quarantine law was passed in Venice in 1377 and mandated quarantine for 30 days. And that later evolved to 40 days because 40 was seen as a holy number. There are lots of references to 40 days in the Bible, 40 days of Lent, Moses spending 40 days receiving the 10 Commandments, Noah being at sea for 40 days during the flood. And the number is, and that's why we have the word quarantine from the French quarante. But coming onto these shores, England has used emergency laws to contain plagues for hundreds and hundreds of years. So in 1578, I think was the first instance of plague orders following a bubonic plague outbreak. And they were imposed during a significant outbreak. And there were major issues with compliance. Measures such as the order to shut up infected houses for 40 days again, were declared in 1550. And there was a regional variation of orders for a long time, so reflecting the different regional orders that were in place, or different regional variations that were in place during the COVID pandemic. But eventually, they were made into national laws, which were very similar to what we saw during the COVID pandemic. So the decree by Queen Elizabeth said that she was specifically directing and commanding the law because the unruly subjects were, by very disorder and for lack of direction, in many parts willfully procure the increase of this general contagion. And the plague orders drawn up in 1578 were posted throughout England in marketplaces, parish churches and local chapels, and were read aloud for the benefit of the majority who could not read. So a bit better than our COVID regulations, which were posted on a website, and pretty much nobody read them, or at least nobody, except me and a few other geeks through the legal community. And there were, at the time, there were 17 rules publicized to manage the spread of the plague, including a plague tax, the appointment of watchers of quarantine houses, burial parties, punishments for those breaking quarantine, the suppression of dangerous opinions, so not dissimilar to some of the laws we've seen, not in the UK, but in other places, dangerous opinions about the plague, the burning of bedding and clothes of those who died from plague. And during the pandemic, I came across Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. I wasn't the only one to come across it. Many people came across it. But his experience of the 1665 bubonic plague outbreak has many parallels to what later happened from 2020. And during the 1660s, there were bans on social gatherings, including, quoting, all plays, bear baitings, games, singing of ballads, buckler play, of such like causes of assemblies by people to be utterly prohibited. And rule breakers were severely punished by every alderman in his ward. All public feasting was banned, and there was a very impressive policy that the money spared that was going to be spent on public feasting was preserved and employed for the benefit and relief of the poor visited with the infection. So something like a furlough scheme back then, or akin to the money, the payments which were given to people who were self-isolating. Alehouses and taverns were not shut, but disorderly tipping was banned, and all venues were to be shut by 9 p.m. each evening. Begging was also prohibited, and disobedience punished. And there were similar restrictions all around the world. In 1683 in Marseille, new laws required that all people suspected of having plague be quarantined, disinfected. And similarly, in fact, in many places, there were very strict rules around ports, because obviously the movement of people was a bit easier to control before air travel. So in ports in North America, quarantine was introduced during the same decade, and attempts made to control yellow fever, which first appeared in the 1680s and 1690s. And again, you see the same kinds of tactics when there were outbreaks of different viruses and diseases. In the cholera outbreaks in the 19th and 20th centuries, societies looked back to the strategies from the bubonic plague and emulated them. Sardinia was the only Italian region to avoid known outbreaks of cholera because there was surveillance by armed men who had orders to prevent by force any ship that attempted to disembark people or cargo on the coast. So they did a sort of Australian style, nobody in, nobody out. Then came 100 years ago the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920, also known as the Spanish flu, which was of similar scale to COVID, infecting around 500 million people across the world, and estimated to have killed, well, depends where you look, but up to possibly 20 million, possibly 50, possibly even 100 million. And the public health infrastructure and authorities were not as well prepared as we were during COVID, but they were significantly better prepared than they had been for previous plagues. A number of island nations quarantined themselves preemptively, including Iceland, Australia, American Samoa. Australia had quarantine of ships for 7 days. And in the UK, as well as across the world, there were social distancing measures, including closing schools, theatres, and places of worship. Although there were very significant variations within countries and between countries. In the UK, the focus was on minimising contact with others, although because there was no national health service at the time, the response was decentralised and pretty sporadic, and never extended to national rules. So interestingly, there were national rules in the Middle Ages, but not during the Spanish flu. Cheltenham Boys' School locked staff and pupils inside the building to protect them from exposure to the flu. Election candidates in Sunderland abandoned house-to-house canvassing and turned down requests to take voters to the polls. It's not clear from the history books whether election campaigning involved ingestion of curry and beer, as it did for the Labour Party during the 2021 elections, but there was a significant and serious restriction. Theatres, dance halls, cinemas, churches in Britain were closed for some months. And in the United States, some of you may have seen there were some good articles at the beginning of the COVID pandemic about the measures that were put in place in the United States. And there's been some really interesting analysis done of the different outcomes of different states that imposed gathering restrictions earlier than others and more strictly. And we also saw a dynamic which revisited during the COVID pandemic, which is the anti-mask protests. So the United States, particularly the West Coast, there was something called the Anti-Mask League, where there was up to 5,000 supporters are reported. And there were huge protests over face covering mandates, including one where I think a protester and a policeman was shot. And I think all of that shows that the idea of social distancing, the idea of restrictions, including curfews, which are close enough to lockdowns, they're just limited in time to certain parts of the day, have been around for a very long time. But just coming back to lockdowns, so I mentioned that really lockdowns only began about 10 years before the COVID pandemic. Sorry, only about 10 years before the COVID pandemic. But the absolute key event in the past couple of decades, which I think led ultimately to lockdowns in one way or the other, was the Sars outbreak of 2002 to 2004, which gave a sort of preview of the kind of harsh measures which we would see with COVID-19. And SARS-1, because of course COVID is SARS number 2, SARS-1 was extremely limited in terms of spread and deaths, even though it was hugely prominent and known through the world. There were only 8,469 cases and 782 deaths reported, and probably because although it was a severe illness, it didn't spread anywhere near as easily as COVID-19. But the measures that states imposed were very significant. In March 2003, Singapore began to enforce compulsory quarantine of any infected person and announced that all primary and secondary schools and junior colleges would be shut. It also, in March, Hong Kong authorities quarantined an entire housing estate during a 200-case outbreak at the building, and the people were later bussed off to quarantine facilities. And this was and the estate was guarded by the police, and that intervention was significant for another reason that I'll come to. When there was a Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, Sierra Leone declared a state of emergency. So it's 2014, and imposed a 3-day lockdown on its entire population. And that was followed by quarantine restrictions that were in place for many months, as well as school closures. And many students lost around almost a year of schooling as a result. But back to the UK, and just to finish off, the immediate history of the lockdown in March 2020, which in one form or another lasted for over 2 years, is really interesting, but the slightly longer history of it is also really interesting. And I think it probably goes back to the 2005 changes made to the international health regulations by the member states of the World Health Organization. And those were as a direct response to the outbreaks of SARS and Ebola. And the key message that was given to states was that within 5 years, they needed to strengthen their public health response capacities so they could rapidly respond to new public health emergencies and also implement any recommendations for the public health measures made by the WHO. They were effectively saying you need to be ready because the next pandemic may not be containable in the same way that SARS might be. But they were pretty vague as to what measures they were talking about. They certainly didn't say you're going to be doing national lockdowns. And they also made clear that any measures would have to be with full respect for dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons, which is in the international health regulations. But within 3 years of the 2005 regulations, the UK Parliament did what they thought the WHO had required and completely turbocharged the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984, which had previously really only been usable as a way of imposing quarantine restrictions. So particularly for people who were exposed to, who were known to be exposed to a virus or known to be suffering from a virus, that's what it was designed to do, and that's what its historical purpose was. And it was used during the AIDS pandemic for that purpose. But in 2008, it was massively upgraded. There were new powers that were given to ministers to do practically anything, quote, for the purpose of protecting against, controlling, or providing a public health response to the incidence or spread of infection or contamination in England. And that could include restrictions on gathering, travel, children attending school, and almost unlimited requirements on or in relation to persons, things, or premises. And there was now famously, or at least in this room famously, there was the emergency declaration, which would allow a minister to bring regulations into force without them being laid before Parliament, before they come into force. And in fact, wouldn't have to be laid before Parliament for up to 28 days, or in some instances more. Really interestingly, for me, I read the debates in Parliament to see whether parliamentarians really knew what they were letting us in for with the passing of this bill, and I don't think they did at all. Earl Howe, also known as Frederick Curzon, in the Lords debate, said, "This is a very sweeping power indeed. I say that because what we are dealing with, because we are dealing here with measures which are not defined in the bill, but which ministers can bring into force more or less at the stroke of a pen without the prior approval of a magistrate. Ministers by regulation are being given considerable power to limit and constrain the daily lives and freedoms of citizens." And Howe asked a government minister, at the time it was the Labour government, for illustrations of the kind of provisions which regulations are likely to contain in the event of, say, what he called, say, a SARS outbreak, and why there was apparently such a low threshold for requirements to be placed on persons, things, and premises. Baroness Stern responded, saying that she gave 3 examples of the kinds of powers that this would be used for. She said one would be a contaminated cargo being dispersed across this country. Secondly, to prevent the spread of avian flu, requiring all individuals working with poultry to wear protective clothing and undertake decontamination. And thirdly, if there was a large outbreak of SARS, the regulations could be used to empower hospitals to require all visitors to SARS patients to wear protective clothing. So there was no discussion at all of national lockdowns, which was no surprise because there hadn't been any national lockdowns. One member of the Lords, Baroness Finlay, who was also a medical doctor, said that she was full of admiration that during the SARS outbreak, the Hong Kong community managed to clamp down on its movements, including self-quarantine on the part of healthcare workers. she said there needed to be powers to impose cautious behaviour because she feared in this country we may not do as well as Hong Kong. That was about as close as we got to those powers really being understood. But obviously, by the 23rd of March 2020, and in the furious scramble to create a legal framework to impose the lockdown over the next 72 hours, and I can tell you, as far as I know, the work on the first set of lockdown regulations began on the 23rd of March. And these were not being worked on before the 23rd of March. And they certainly weren't in the coronavirus bill, which was going through Parliament that very week. But that's a story for another day. So where does that brief hop, skip and jump through history leave us? Where I come to is that compulsory social distancing and gathering restrictions and laws backing them up are centuries old. And they certainly are part of our world history. And they're also part of our modern history in the sense that although, in the sense that the Spanish flu, not in living memory, but close enough, was a very similar kind of outbreak as COVID, and very similar things happened, but just not on a national level and not as strict. And maybe the various reasons that may be the case. But more recently, the idea of national lockdowns, I think, was effectively a new idea, had never been authorized by the World Health Organization, but in the sort of panic at the beginning of COVID-19, lockdowns were suddenly alighted upon as the answer to the question that was being asked, or the threat that was being posed by COVID. And that is also, whether that was right or wrong is also a discussion for another day. And finally, the law that was used to impose lockdowns in the UK and gave such immense powers to ministers, which have been really well articulated in the book that is being launched today. I'm dubious that Parliament ever properly grappled with the implications. And by the time the implications became clear, Parliament had been reduced down, had been diminished to effectively a tick box, a chamber of a tick box exercise, not a true scrutinizer of the lockdown laws. So we may or may not be done with COVID. Certainly doesn't feel like it in this house right now, but we certainly are at a stage we can look back and try and learn lessons. And I'm very pleased indeed that the Routledge Handbook of Law and the COVID pandemic achieves this. So thank you very much for writing it, to everyone who's been involved.
Sorry, I just very unceremoniously dragged my chair across. Adam has very kindly agreed to answer one or two questions. And I would say that because we don't have a microphone in the audience, please keep them short so I can remember and repeat them. And I will use my brutal, oh, there is, oh, never mind. I was going to use my executive authority to change your questions, but I won't. While anyone is thinking of any questions that they'd like to ask Adam, I'm going to abuse my executive authority as chair of this four-person table to ask, it's very true that those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it, but what do you think would be a key lessons that you would want to be learned, especially by Parliament, shall we say, from your own lessons of history?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I loved about the book is that the contributors really identify examples of this being done well. And I mean that by this, I mean allowing for scrutiny of emergency laws. I think one thing that history quite clearly shows, and the COVID-19 pandemic is another example of, is that the dynamic of put it like this, the sort of legal and social and psychological dynamic of emergencies is often pretty similar across different emergencies. Everybody panics for a start. There is a very significant shift towards authoritarian solutions. So people are, even people who might a day before have balked at the kinds of authoritarian solutions that are being proposed, suddenly, because of fear and because of panic, say, oh, what we really need is strong measures and let's forget about the niceties. I think that dynamic is so common across history that it's almost a truism. And we put in place lots of, in a developed democracy, we have in theory lots of safety measures to prevent the worst things happening during those crises, because crises moments, as well as being existential threats to society because of the crisis, also can be existential threats to democracy because of the crisis. You can end up burning all of your bridges trying to stop something which is admittedly very dangerous, but unnecessarily. And I think that the lesson in this country, in the UK, that we really do need to learn is that what happened wasn't the only thing that could have happened. I think that's also another dynamic of crises, that there's a certain kind of fatalism. It's as if the crisis is in charge and you're just going to have to deal with whatever happens, and whatever happens was inevitable. And I just think that's wrong. I think a lot has to do with the legal mechanisms that happen to be in place at the time when the crisis happened. So in our case, this sort of monster of a law, the Public Health Act, which had never really been thought through, the lack of a constitution or any kind of strong human rights law to allow for court scrutiny of what was going on, and finally the government itself, which just happened to be a government that has very little respect for democratic accountability and institutions. That's just not the government we had. So I think in combination, those factors created a lot of the problems that occurred, which are well known and really well set out in the book. So I think the lesson we can learn is that we can put in place much better protections and fail-safes and safeguards to ensure that next time this happens, which could be next week and it could be in decades or whenever, the next time we are much better prepared institutionally and in terms of the state to deal with the crisis, as well as having lots of face masks and hospital capacity and all of those health measures that we also need. But the state measures are just as important.
Many thanks. And now I turn to the, might I say, very beautiful, attractive, and intelligent audience, and ask if we have any questions. Can I pass it over?
Thank you very much, Adam. To start with, I came across you with your explanations online of what I'm going to call legal communication. Sage came in for a lot of criticisms on science communication, and you touched on it briefly, that you don't think that parliamentarians were aware of what they were passing through in the legal sense. How much do you think the lack of legal communication to the public was connected to the lack of preparation of legal, or are they connected in different topics?
Excellent question.
That's a really good question, and I just have to think about what the answer is. I mean, there's lots of aspects to that. I mean, I'll give you an example. So I think the part of the problem with the legal communication was the government changed the law too often, and the laws became so complicated they were not really possible to communicate well. So the lockdown law started at 11 pages on a PDF, by the steps and tiers regulations, like less than a year later, was over 100 pages, sort of 130 pages, I think, at one point. You started, I think you went from something like 7 exceptions to the gatherings restrictions to more than 40. And on the one hand, the government were trying to be liberal. They were trying to be less harsh and to be responsive to people's needs, which was admirable. But the trade-off was that the laws became too complicated and impossible to digest. And on top of that, you had this very strange dynamic between guidance and law, which the government started. There were lots of patterns which were in place from the very beginning, from the 23rd of March onwards, which just remained, whether because that's the way the government planned it or just because of momentum. But one of them was the difference between the guidance and the law. So the guidance was always different to the law, in quite fundamental respects. The first example, which was very prominent, and which I actually got two complaints to my regulator for trying to explain on TV the difference, was that the guidance says you were allowed out for one kind of exercise per day, and the law didn't have a limit. That was just repeated in lots and lots of ways throughout, and ministers would go on TV and be utterly befuddled by the laws which were just being passed, that morning or late in the evening before. It was just hopeless. There was no, and I think probably probably the political reason for it, not political, probably the institutional reason for it, was that there wasn't a clear strategy from the government, and there wasn't a clear direction, and there wasn't clear leadership. There was a pretty haphazard and multi-directional approach to, and there were a lot of arguments going on within government, and I think that was reflected in these strange laws that were written on the hoof. And I think that was very, very difficult for lots and lots of people, because these weren't ordinary laws. These were laws that were that were deciding whether you could leave the house or hug your grandma or see your children. So that unclearness was inexcusable in a way.
And the final question, go ahead, Ronan.
Thank you. Ronan Cormican from the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law. And for present purposes, I should also admit that I've drafted quite a few of the coronavirus regulations on behalf of the government in Northern Ireland. So not so much a question, more of a counterpoint. And the counterpoint is time and the legislative process. So the amount of time it takes to normally prepare the policy, consult on it, draft a statutory instrument is a couple of months. For the COVID regulations, when they're being made, you had a couple of days perhaps to do a really complicated series of a complicated set of provisions to get into law. Now that simply isn't enough time. So Adam's talked about them being drafted on the hoof and haphazard, and that's probably accurate. But in view of the time available, it simply isn't possible to get all the things done in a proper, sustainable, accessible, intelligible way. And it's yes, there clearly are problems with the coronavirus regulations, which in the Bingham Centre we've been criticising quite a lot. But I think there has to be an appreciation of the difficulty in producing a large body of law in such a short period of time, and the responsibility of getting it absolutely right, and the knowledge that if you don't get it right, you're going to create a loophole that someone from a red list country can come into the UK and there's no protection and there's nothing stopping them, for example. So yes, I think that has to be borne in mind when we're considering the justified criticism of some of the coronavirus rules.
I think that's a really fair point. And one thing I should have made clear is at no point am I criticising the people who had the difficult job of drafting these things, often, well, almost always late into the night after last minute policy changes and that sort of thing. And I think also that your challenge, the other reason that it's an important one is because I should say that it's easy to criticize what happened without really paying account of the fact that what was going on in the world and in the country with the pandemic and the changing nature and understanding of the virus, literally changing through variants, but also, the scientific understanding of the virus changing, was, incredibly difficult. And that it's not as if there's any particular country that just found the magic solution to the problems. I think even at the time this, some of the essays in this book were written, the understanding of, say, China's zero COVID policy was slightly different, and now we're seeing the sort of semi-permanent impact of that policy and the really sort of troubling implications of that. So I think it's very easy for people on the outside, as I was, to criticize. But one of the reasons that I was so focused on explaining what was going on, explaining the laws, was because I didn't feel comfortable being sort of sucked into the anti-lockdown type approach of everything the government's doing is pernicious and evil, and rights are being taken away for no good reason, or for pernicious reasons, which I just didn't believe. So full respect to the people who were drafting those laws, and I think let's just try and figure out how to do it better next time from an accountability perspective, and also try and involve Parliament more for the for reasons of just making better laws.
I was going to ask Adam if he had any final words that he wishes everyone in this room to take away, but I actually think that was a lovely one. I will give him the opportunity, though, if there's any final words of wisdom before we thank you again and wish you well.
Not from me. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really pleased. Hopefully, one day I'll be able to leave this room that I've been stuck in for 2 years and actually do an event in person.
Well, on the note of acknowledging the challenge and difficulty of regulating during an emergency, but again, the central importance of accountability, of democracy, of protecting rights, I'd like everyone to again thank the very wonderful Adam for joining us. I now turn to my very wonderful friend and colleague, Alice, for some other words.
Thank you. Yes, I have the best job, actually, I think, which is to do thank yous. And I promise I won't take too long to do it because I'm keeping you from the wine. So thank you, obviously, to all of you for coming. Thank you to the Bingham Centre very much for hosting us. And I want to be a bit self-indulgent and thank my wonderful co-editor Joelle. So people often say that delivering a book or a PhD thesis is a bit like giving birth in a way, with all its pain and fulfillment and everything. But that wasn't enough for Joelle. We delivered the book in September, and in November she had an actual baby, to whom, of course, we've dedicated the book with much love and joy to dear Sean, who I think has retired hurt from the proceedings. So we know that he will grow up to be a champion for human rights and the rule of law. No pressure on Sean there. So thank you also very much to our wonderful colleagues at Middlesex. I'm going to say for the third time, thank you to Laurent, who is our head of department and nevertheless friend, who I think sets the tone in our department, in our school at Middlesex, for a place which is collegiate, which is stimulating, which is welcoming, which is a pleasure to work in. And thank you to the dear colleagues who've come this evening. I won't rattle off names, but you know who you are. We're so grateful to you for being here. We had hoped to welcome Alison Kirk, who was the colleague at Routledge that we liaised with from submitting the book proposal, which was, I think, February last year, which she accepted with alacrity through the whole production process to publication barely a year later. But unfortunately, she's been in contact with COVID and has a sore throat and couldn't be here. So another casualty, but we wish we could have met her in person. We wanted also to thank our two fabulous research assistants on the book, one of whom I'm delighted to say is here, Felicitas Benziger, who is a PhD student at Middlesex, and the other who couldn't join us is Maaike de Ridder, who's based in Belgium. But Felicitas, since you are here, we'd like to give you well, it's not that small, it's quite a heavy gift, which is a copy of the book. So,
I would warmly encourage everyone to read the preface, in which we do give her a job reference.
absolutely, yes. And our academic colleagues will know how precious Felicitas and Micah both were in helping us to format the footnotes, Oscola style. So that was a true service to us. And thank you again, Felicitas. It was such a pleasure. And then finally, I want to, actually not finally, sorry. I next want to thank my wonderful partner, Dave, who's here lurking at the back. And I'm sure Joelle would want to say the same about her wonderful partner, Tom, who I think has had to retire with the baby. Yeah, to our wonderful partners and families, and of course, friends who've supported us through so much. But where I did want to end is with thanking our authors. So the book has 38 chapters, but 53 in total contributors due to some co-authoring. And we're very happy that we have a very small select number of them tonight. So I think 4 of them are here. We have Rasha and Sam, who wrote a fantastic chapter on minority rights. We have Dean Knight at the back from New Zealand, who happened to be in London and wrote our wonderful chapter on New Zealand. And we have Yolinda that works at the Bingham Centre, who co-authored a chapter with Joelle on the rule of law. So thank you for representing the body of authors here tonight. And actually the reason why there are so few here is a reason we're quite proud of, in a sense, which is that this was a really international book. So most of our authors are not based in the UK, but are based in the countries, or at least in the regions about which they were writing. So this is a book that's written very much from the vantage point of practitioners and researchers, or sometimes both, rooted in the countries that they were writing about. But we owe all of them a huge debt, not least because of the speed with which the book was produced, which was, relative to academic publishing, which of course can be glacially slow, was very quick. So I actually had hip surgery, I think it was June 2nd last year. And I remember editing the first chapter that came in a couple of days before that. And then we submitted the whole manuscript in September. So between effectively June and September, all 38 chapters were written, edited, etc. And I must say that all of our authors put up with our sort of gently hectoring emails and reminders and so on with absolute good grace. And there was not a single chapter that ended up holding up the production schedule, which was a miracle, quite honestly. And I think what was also very, we felt like we were in a community with our authors in the end, because of course, everybody was working under some duress, under different conditions of lockdown. We had authors, of course, in India and China and Brazil, all over the world. And they were trying also to analyze a moving target, essentially, of the lockdown restrictions, the levels, or often the lack of accountability in each of their respective jurisdictions, or sometimes thematic chapters, as well as living themselves as individuals with the virus, with the lockdown restrictions, with family members who were ill and so on. So we were very mindful all the way through that we were writing about a subject, but without that kind of distance that one normally has, that with the authors were living through it as well. We had a very good start. Of course, as we know, one of the reasons for the speed was that the 2 symposia that Laura mentioned earlier, that Joelle performed miracles really to convene in April 2020 and April 2021. Quite a few of the authors had written blog posts for that, which were then turned into chapters. So we did have a head start. But we thank so much the authors who are here, and also the authors who couldn't be with us for their patience and generosity. So I don't want to say too much more in terms of the content of the book, but I did look back at our preface today, short preface, which we wrote in September 2021, when the number of confirmed deaths from COVID worldwide stood at 4,575,000 or thereabouts. And I looked at the latest figure today, and it was 6.33 million, and that's confirmed deaths from COVID. They are figures that really defy any kind of imagination. They show also, of course, that the pandemic is not over, and nor is the battle for equitable vaccine distribution. And then nor either is what Adam finished by talking about, the need to understand and address the impact the pandemic had on our body politic, if you like, and the effects on our political, legal systems, our economies, our societies. So that is really where the book aims to make its modest contribution on how to govern under emergency and how to prepare best for the next time. So in the book, I think we find these rich accounts of national responses at national and indeed local level in the countries which are covered, as well as the transversal themes. And we learn, for example, that democracies and autocracies, the regime type didn't necessarily predict the success of response. At that, some democracies did well, some did very badly. Likewise with autocracies. So you don't see a clear correlation or causal pattern in terms of regime type and success at tackling the virus. I think another very strong theme from the book is public trust and legitimacy, and the importance of tackling disinformation as well, that these are of cardinal importance in combating disease. The book documents the risk, of course, of executive overreach. States such as Hungary, Egypt, Turkey, many others, which use the pandemic as a cover for further advancing illiberalism, authoritarianism, but also underreach by governments, the abdication of responsibility, Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi to some extent, and those who engaged in denial and fantastical thinking, quack cures and rejection of science and so on. So all of that is in the book. And as Adam said, and I want to finish here too, the importance really, I hope that readers will take from it is to learn, to prepare for the future. And we hope that the book therefore will be a guide to action for ensuring that democratic values, human rights and the rule of law are among the building blocks of recovery. And with perfect timing, our mascot, Sean, has just come back into the room. So I will definitely end there so that everybody can go and have a look at our champion of the rule of law in his crown. Thank you.
In hopes that my lovely son is now asleep and this clapping, wait, he's not, okay. On that note, can I please invite everyone to drink, to be merry, and in what is my favorite toast, the hope that the year ahead is better than the last, but not half as good as the next. Have a drink, everyone.